ghoulies and ghosties.
From ghoulies and ghosties.
And long-leggedy beasties.
And long-leggedy beasties.
And
things that go bump in the night. Good Lord! Deliver us.
Deliver us.
Ladies and gentlemen, from Pennsylvania, the master of ceremonies, Count Drahoon.
Hello, spooks and spookettes. Count Drahoon here, and I'm back. Again. I know, you're tired of hearing about it. But listen, your count has had a phenomenal year, all thanks to you and your support. It's been hectic but very rewarding, particularly this past Halloween season. But it's been very difficult to sort of capture everything that I've been up to behind the scenes. So this evening I wanted to present to you something a little special. I'm going to take you through some highlights of some of the shows that I've been participating in all October long, starting with my newest endeavor that I'm doing primarily around my adoptive homeland, Murfreesboro, Tennessee, this neat little thing I call a Microcinema, where I host horror films all across my new homeland. I also had the chance to go back to Gardena Cinema for the last weekend in October to do an epic 2-day Universal Studios monster movie marathon. I got to post films, I participated in live interviews and Q&As. It was so much fun, and I'm happy to present to you some of the clips and highlights of your count's busiest and most successful Halloween season 2024. Let's get right into the heart of the matter, and hopefully you won't feel the need to drive a stake through it. Here are some highlight clips of my October shows for the Microcinema at Hot Springs in Murfreesboro, Tennessee. So, a little bit of a humble brag on my part, if you don't mind. I actually had the privilege of watching this film about a year ago at the New Beverly Cinema in Hollywood, California. I saw it on its original 35mm film. It was a great experience, but anyway. Also, so just to remind you again, the filmmakers for the movie, the writers, were Gloria Katz and Willard Hoyk. Hoyk, of course, got the director's credit, and I tried so hard to avoid a Hoyk Tua joke. I almost got through the evening without making one, but I failed miserably. So the original title of this movie was actually The Second Coming, but eventually the film got some new financiers that urged the filmmakers to change the name of the film. The movie was actually shot in 1970, but wasn't released until 1973 because of this falling out with the previous investors. So they got the new financiers, they got enough money in the budget to finish post-production, and this film made its debut in 1973 in Paris, Texas. That's for all of you Winders fans out there. That's a deep cut for cinephiles out there. This film was going to be re-released in 1978 to a much wider distribution deal, but it never came to be because the distributors wanted to call the movie Return of the Living Dead. And George Romero caught wind of this, and he was none too pleased, so he sued them and had it shut down. And of course, the actual Return of the Living Dead came out sometime in the 1980s. Most of the extras in this movie, the cannibal, vampires, hippies, whatever you want to call them, they were actually laid off NASA workers. And the cops that you saw in this film were actual local policemen. They found out that they weren't getting paid for their services, so they arrested the star, Michael Greer, and held him for ransom until Katz and Hoyk paid up. true story. So the biggest production expenses for this movie, Michael Greer's suits, which, by the way, ladies, is he charming or creepy? Or somewhere in the middle? Okay. That's what I thought. The zipper line kind of gave me the wheelies a little bit. It was funny, but not for the right reasons. So his suits were one of the biggest production costs, and also the 1 day of shooting that they got for Charlie, who was the homeless man that they were interviewing towards the beginning of the movie. That is veteran character actor Elisha Cook. If you're a classic horror fan, you may have seen him in a few other films, such as House on Haunted Hill and The Night Stalker. He also happened to be an alcoholic in House on Haunted Hill. I don't think that that is a commentary of his actual being. So, well, let's hope not, at least. Okay, so we are down to the second half of our evil theme for Monster Movie Monday here at Hot Springs. Is there anyone out in the audience tonight who is seeing Evil Dead 2 for the first time? Anyone? Okay, well, okay, so we have a few. That's good. So here's the thing. Evil Dead 2 is technically a sequel. It's part of a trilogy. But don't let that discourage you, because you're going to watch this movie. You're not going to be totally lost if you haven't seen the first Evil Dead. This movie is really, it's part sequel, but it's also part retelling of the first movie. But Sam Raimi was given a much bigger budget than his initial film, The Evil Dead, which debuted in 1980, of course starring the iconic Bruce Campbell, who makes his way back into Evil Dead 2, reprising his role as Ash Campbell. He really went all out with this one, and in a way he sort of changed the trajectory of the Evil Dead franchise, as it were. I mean, he basically created a franchise through this movie, but he also sort of added this really unique blend of horror comedy that wasn't quite as present in the first film, that I think really makes this one of the most enduring horror franchises ever made. It's also interesting to note, the first two Evil Dead films were shot in the South. The first Evil Dead was actually shot in Morristown, Tennessee, not terribly far from here. I think that's about a 3 or 4 hour drive, give or take. And then Evil Dead 2 was actually shot in Wadesboro, North Carolina. But executive producer Dino De Laurentiis wanted Sam Raimi to film a lot closer to the production office in Wilmington, North Carolina. But Raimi had other ideas. He wanted to make sure that the studio did not interfere in the making of his movie. Wanted as little studio interference as possible, and I think that instinct to film 3 hours away from the main production office, I think that paid off ultimately. So you're going to see a tremendous film. Again, the genius of Bruce Campbell, writer-director Sam Raimi. Here from 1987, it is Evil Dead 2, Dead by Dawn. So, interesting tidbits about this movie. Originally, Joe Dante, who directed Gremlins, was slated to direct this film. He brought in a guy named Nigel Neal to come in and write the screenplay for Halloween 3, but he wrote sort of a weird murder mystery comedy, and it just wasn't working. But eventually, Joe Dante moved on from the project, and Carpenter brought in Tommy Lee Wallace to co-write the film that we just watched tonight, along with John Carpenter. Also, I think there is a shared cinematic universe between Halloween 3 Season of the Witch and the original Invasion of the Body Snatchers from 1956, because both films take place in Santa Mira, California. So maybe Cochran wasn't actually a witch. Maybe he was one of those body snatchers. We may have Stephen King to thank for Evil Dead 2. So as the story goes, he was having lunch with Dino De Laurentiis during the production of Maximum Overdrive sometime in 1986. And Stephen King was a huge fan of the first Evil Dead, that he insisted that Dino fund the sequel for Evil Dead. Dino either really loved Stephen King, really loved the first movie, or somewhere in the middle, and decided that they would in fact fund, Evil Dead 2 Dead by Dawn. It went into production in 1986, and the film was released in 1987. Now, I don't think that this movie would have been possible, would have been as memorable if it was not for the genius of Bruce Campbell as the star. Also a co-producer for the first and second film. And you know, I want to talk about the genius of Bruce Campbell just for a quick second. You remember the scene in the kitchen where he was fighting his possessed hand? He did that in one take. Wow. It was completely improvised. Sam Raimi loved it so much that they shot it in one take, and he said, "That's it. It's going in the film." And in the final cut of the film, it's that one take that they got in. It's absolutely brilliant. And of course, Ash is perhaps the greatest hero in all of horror movies, maybe besides Carl Kolchak. But you know, it's interesting because the producers were actually afraid that this movie was going to get an X rating because of all the blood and the gore in it. So they decided to change the color of the blood. So some of the demons bleed green, some of them bleed blue, and they thought, hey, this should be good enough for us to get, you know, a standard rating with the MPAA. And they were wrong. The MPAA gave them an X rating anyway. So they decided to, as a workaround, they would just go ahead and release the film as unrated. But of course, over the years, it was upgraded or downgraded, depending on how you view it, to an R rating because, well, let's face it, there have been way gorier movies to have come out since then.
Those were a lot of fun. I'm happy to say that I will be doing more shows out of Hop Springs and Cedar Glade Brews, both venues in Murfreesboro, Tennessee. We haven't announced any official dates yet, but be sure to follow me on social media at CountDrahoon, Instagram, X, and Facebook to find out when I have some upcoming shows and official dates and times. Up next, I'm going to show you some highlights of the 2-day Universal Studios Monster Movie Marathon that I did at Gardena Cinema. I hosted 10 movies in 2 days. Creature from the Black Lagoon in 3D, Frankenstein, Bride of Frankenstein, The Mummy, The Invisible Man, the Spanish version of Dracula, Phantom of the Opera, the 1931 version of Dracula with Bela Lugosi, The Wolfman, and Abbott and Costello Meet Frankenstein. Here's some of my favorite highlights from those shows.
The cast is always worth repeating until after 1931. So I was very fortunate for the last 2 days because all of the movies were made post-1931. So I always had just a few extra seconds of prep time for the microphone. But with Dracula and the Spanish version of Dracula, it makes me have to speed up the process a little bit. But, you know, Bela Lugosi once said that Dracula is a blessing and a curse, and Dracula never dies. And if you think about Lugosi's trajectory, his career trajectory, it makes a lot of sense. He was, of course, typecasted in mostly horror films throughout his career and low-budget B horror films in the latter part of his career. And unfortunately, Dwight Frye, who played Renfield in this movie, he's pretty much suffered the same fate. He was essentially relegated to play the henchman of the monsters. Of course, he would play Fritz in Frankenstein, Carl in Bride of Frankenstein, but even in low-budget films like The Vampire Bat or Dead Men Walking, he was basically made to play the servant of a vampire or basically a red herring in some cases. And it's really sad because Dwight Frye actually had a very versatile career on the American stage. He had done everything from comedies, leading romantic roles, and now all he'll ever be remembered for is a guy that loved to eat bugs. It's interesting, Lugosi is so synonymous with Dracula, and yet he only officially played Dracula on screen twice. Although he played many vampires and vampire-like characters, he only actually played Count Dracula in 1931 and in 1948 in Abbott and Costello Meet Frankenstein. And wouldn't you know it, for both films, he was neither the first or second choice. He was the third choice. In 31, of course, the first choice was Lon Chaney, and in 48, the first choice was John Kennedy. Now, of
course, we couldn't go with Lon Chaney because Lon Chaney passed away in early 1930. And John Carradine was mixed up in some legal issues with a really nasty divorce he was in the middle of in the 40s. But choice number 2 was an actor named Ian Keith. And outside of his small role as the Admiral in It Came Beneath the Sea, I have no idea why this guy was in consideration to play Dracula. So in both cases, Lugosi actually had to fight pretty hard to essentially win the role that he had played. You know, in 31 he played so well on Broadway, and in 48 at this point he was a legend for playing Dracula. He also played the Frankenstein monster in The Ghost of Frankenstein, and he also played Cottus the Mummy in The Mummy's Ghost. Of course, he didn't play the Invisible Man, but he played the Wolfman, so he's the only big universal horror king that has that distinction, so good for him. One more thing I'd like to point out before we transition into our next segment. The chemistry between Lon Chaney and Evelyn Ankers, I mean, it seems like they really loved each other, right? Well, they hated each other in real life. Lon Chaney liked to play pranks. He was a big fan of pulling practical jokes on sets, and he pulled one prank in particular where he put a non-venomous snake in Miss Ankers' dressing room, and she was none too pleased about that. Some folks found Lon Chaney's jokes to be very endearing. Others, like Miss Ankers, found them to be quite obnoxious. So I think it's just, it depends on what your temperament is and what your sense of humor is. So moving on, we are gearing up for our last film of the evening, which of course is the 5th and final time that Lon Chaney Jr. would appear as the Wolfman. He would return 2 years later after the Wolfman in 1943 for Frankenstein Meets the Wolfman, and then House of Frankenstein in 1944 and House of Dracula in 1945. Although we are fortunate though in this last movie, we get to see a little bit more werewolf transitioning. We couldn't see so much in House of Dracula because of the war effort. There was a shortage of yak hair, which is what they used for the werewolf transformation. So, just a quick note about the audio. I do apologize. We weren't able to set up our normal camera setup for these shows, so a lot of the footage that you're seeing were shot on iPhones. We did the best we could, so hopefully it's still enjoyable for your eyes and ears. One of the funnest aspects of hosting the Universal Studios Monster Movie Marathon at Gardena was that I also got to host live Q&As and interviews with some very esteemed guests. One of them was Antonia Carlotta, the host of Universally Me, which is a great web series on YouTube. She talks a lot about the history of classic horror films, specifically the classic horror films at Universal Studios, and she comes at it from a fantastic perspective, being the great-great-grandniece of Carl Laemmle, the founder of Universal Studios. So here is my uninterrupted, unabridged interview with Antonia Carlotta.
Yeah. What have you all watched? Those are like literally 2 of my favorites.
And we're going into your personal favorite, right?
Yes.
Bride of Frankenstein.
Bride of Frankenstein is my favorite of the Universal monster movies. The creature, Frankenstein, is probably my favorite monster. And then Creature from the Black Lagoon is up there. It's just hard for me because my family didn't make that movie,
Sure.
but I love that movie.
Just out of curiosity, have you ever had the opportunity to see it in 3D?
I have not.
Okay, let me tell you, it is mind-blowing.
Really?
Really, it was something else. I've seen that movie, I don't know, maybe 100 times. And that was the first time I'd ever seen it in 3D. And it really does add something very special to it.
I mean, just seeing a movie on the big screen in general, I feel like is really special. It's not often that we can see these movies the way that they were like originally intended and the way that audiences did 90 years ago. But yeah, I can imagine the extra elements of 3D would be something else.
Absolutely. So speaking on that, you know, you're a plethora of information, and you yourself, you're a fan of these movies. So I have to know, what made you want to essentially preserve the legacy of your family, because with such a, dare I say, a royal lineage here in Hollywood, some folks would kind of be intimidated by that and shy away from it, but you went the opposite route. So tell me, what's that like?
Yeah, I didn't always understand my lineage or about my family history. My mom had moved out of Los Angeles a little bit before I was born, so I grew up in Connecticut until I was 13. So I had no context really for the movies or what my family had done. I'm sure my mom said sometimes that my family had worked in movies, and we had like pictures on our staircase of Uncle Carl and Junior and my great-grandfather who was a director, stuff like that. We had pictures of them on movie sets, but it's still, it's like a 7-year-old, what's that gonna mean to me? When I was 13, that's when I moved to Los Angeles, and suddenly, I can go to Universal and I see the Laemmle theaters that have my family name on them, and I have friends whose family work in the movies, and some of them have heard of my family, and that started to just turn my mind on to that my family had done something special right there. Then I started going through our family stuff, pictures and letters, and learning more about what Carl Laemmle had accomplished, because he started Universal, and that in itself is a really big accomplishment, but he also won a Supreme Court case against Thomas Edison, and he invented the concept of a movie star and the movie studio tour, and he saved hundreds of Jewish refugees by bringing them to the United States when the Nazi regime was coming to power. So he did all of these amazing things, and I started to realize that I had never really heard much about my uncle. No one else had heard that much about him, and I think it was this really big travesty to me, and that's what made me kind of lean into my family history and start, I made my YouTube series, and I come to stuff like this and share about it, because, I just think it's amazing.
So where did the story begin? I mean, what crept into your uncle's head to say, you know what, this motion picture thing is where it's all at?
Yeah, it didn't happen until a little bit later in his life. He was a German immigrant. He moved to the United States as a teenager, sort of in search of the American dream, as so many people did back then. And he worked all sorts of jobs for the next 20-something years. So he worked, in a pharmacy and on a farm, and he worked in a clothing store in Oshkosh, Wisconsin for 12 years, which is where he got married and he had kids. And when he was 39 years old, he got in a wage dispute with his boss, and he kind of impulsively quit. And then he had his oh my god moment of, I'm almost 40, I've got a family to support, what am I gonna do? I want a career, not just a job. So he thought he was gonna go into 5 and 10 cent stores. He sort of liked the idea of selling really cheap things to lots of people. And while he was scouting for spaces in Chicago, he stumbles upon his very first theater, which was still super new and super novel at the time. And he sees this line of people waiting outside, and he sees, just how many people are going through, and he himself goes into the theater and watches the movies for a bit, and he kind of has his whole this is what I'm gonna do. So yeah, he invested his whole life savings into a theater. It did so well that within a month he was able to open up a second theater. That did really well. He got into distribution because there was no quality control at the time over films that were coming to your theaters. So you might get the same one as the guy next door. You might get a really old or blurry or fake film, or pirated film. So anyway, he got into distribution, and then he started making movies. And it was really this just natural growth because he got in right place, right time.
And so your uncle made a go at it, was one of the early, shall we say, early magnates in the film industry. But he ran up against a pretty big obstacle, and the obstacle was a person, and he has a name, pretty well known, a guy named Thomas Edison. Maybe you've heard of him. And, well, obviously I want you to explain a little bit more, but, and you'll forgive me for your account's crass humor. But even though Thomas Edison is credited with all sorts of great inventions and has truly earned his place in American history, he was, some would argue, maybe America's first patent troll. So you mentioned earlier that your uncle was involved in a case with him, so please tell us about Lemley versus Edison.
Yeah, so, Thomas Edison has this reputation of being an amazing inventor, and I'm sure some of that is true, but more than anything, Thomas Edison knew how to use the legal system to his favor, and that was his real skill. In the early days of the film business, Thomas Edison was one of the kind of early big guys in the film business, and he had patents over kind of all of the pieces of the business, so projectors and cameras and film and all of these different things. And he created a system where if you wanted to make, distribute, or exhibit a film, you would have to pay the trust, is what it was called, almost like your membership fee. And they had all sorts of rules that you had to follow to do that. So it was really keeping the industry down. It was a big barrier to entry. And they weren't really providing a lot of value. They were just bullying people into paying them for the privilege of being in the industry. So Carl Laemmle was one of the first who decided to go independent and make movies outside of the trust. And that was actually kind of a scary thing. Thomas Edison had what now sort of history calls his goons that would come to like destroy your sets and ruin your equipment and like destroy your business. And like I said, Thomas Edison knew how to use the legal system. So in Carl Laemmle's case, Thomas Edison sued him 289 times. I think more than anything, just hoping to exhaust him and overwhelm him out of the business. Uncle Carl fought back the whole time. He fought every single one and he won, and it did go up to the Supreme Court and he won that as well. And in the meantime, while he's going against Edison, in the early days of the industry, it started actually in New Jersey. Fort Lee, New Jersey was really kind of the birthplace of the film industry. So in the meantime, Carl moved a lot of his productions from New Jersey down to Cuba for a bit, so that he could like get some distance between him and Edison. And then that's really what caused the early migration of filmmakers out to California. So in the midst of this trust fight, Carl Laemmle buys Universal City out here and moves all of his productions west.
So on that note, making the move out to California, and from there, I mean, your uncle, basically, he created what we know as the studio.
Yeah.
Because he made movies there, and he made, and I think we had done some research, and he made hundreds of movies a year. Most predominantly westerns, because let's just face it, that studio is a perfect location for westerns with the hills and just being in the West, literally. But from there, it was such a big tract of land, they inadvertently, or really inadvertently, because this was really more of a marketing thing, they created Universal City.
Yeah, I mean, he just didn't do anything halfway. So he bought this tract of land kind of over the Cahuenga Pass, which at the time people thought was a little crazy. It was like out of what was becoming the center of Hollywood. He bought this huge land. It was a chicken ranch, and he decides he's going to turn it into just a full movie-making city. So people lived at Universal, they worked at Universal. It had its own police force and hospital and schoolhouse and anything that you would need in a city. For a long time, it had the biggest zoo on this side of the Mississippi, and every building would double as a film set. So it was like very functional or practical. And then his first big publicity move for Universal City was he boarded a train out east and picked people up to come to Universal City for his big opening day celebration. So that was his first thing. And then he started the movie studio tour. So people could pay, I think it was 25 cents. You get a whole tour of the studio to see where movies were made, which was, I mean, it's still novel today, but like hyper novel back then. It was silent films and a lot of westerns, so people were encouraged to like cheer on the good guys and boo the bad guys while they're watching these movies be made. And then because it was still a functioning chicken ranch, you could pay an extra nickel and take a basket of eggs home at the end of the day.
Wow. If only we could go back to 25-cent studio tour today, that would be nice. So, your uncle was a tremendous success. And of course, we should also note that when he was in New Jersey before he made the move to California, the company was known as a different name before it was Universal. He changed it from, was it the Independent?
Yeah, the Independent Moving Pictures Company, and which shortened to IMP, and he had a little like devil character as his logo, which was kind of a taunt to Thomas Edison. And then it was in the fight that he combined with some other independent companies to become Universal.
He trolled the troll, so.
And Universal, I think his idea there, as you said, he was making like hundreds of films every year, and he just wanted to make films that had the widest audience possible. He wanted universal films that everyone could relate to.
I guess it sort of changed just a little bit because, Uncle Carl got older and he recognized that it was time to hand over the reins to his son, Carl Jr. Carl Jr., every bit as brilliant and as insightful as his father, but rather than wanting to do your uncle's approach and make hundreds of different kinds of movies at a lower budget, Junior really wanted to make more prestige pictures. But even more, I guess, starkly from your uncle, he really wanted to sort of dive into the macabre, into the scary stuff. And my question is, what do you think drove Carl Jr. to I guess, basically be 100 years ahead of his time? to see that there would be a market for disturbing stories, horror stories.
Yeah, I mean, I'll start by saying that Junior was really special because he was he was born in 1909, so I think he was born around the same time that GIMP started. He was 3 when Universal started. He grew up just following his dad around, sort of being primed to take over his dad's place as head of the company. And for his 21st birthday, he became head of production. That was sort of his gift, which was nepotism in some ways, and that's what people called it out as. But he was so experienced by that point and had spent so much time learning the business. His mom had passed away when he was about 11 years old. She died in the Spanish flu pandemic of 1918. And according to some interviews that there are of him, that's around the time when he himself gets into the dark and the macabre. So I think that maybe his mom's death might have sent him on this journey of just contemplating mortality and life and death and what it all means. So when he turns 21, he's taking over as head of production. The first big change he wants to make, as you said, is he wants to make fewer films each year for a much bigger budget. And then he really wanted to explore these darker themes. And so he's the one that really pushed for the first film, which was Dracula, to be made. Carl Laemmle Sr. at first wasn't really convinced, again, where he wanted to make these films that were universal, that everybody would go to. He knew that this is the first supernatural horror film that Universal is making. It doesn't have this earthly normal explanation. It will ostracize a lot of audiences. It will ostracize certain religious audiences. It will ostracize people who are just scared of stuff like that or contemplating things like that. But Junior, he had the business knowledge, he had youth on his side, and he had this sort of fascination that pushed ahead. And when Dracula came out, it was a huge success. And he instantly then turned his attention to Frankenstein, which again, Carl Laemmle Sr. is well, what if that was a fluke? What if that was just a one-off? Maybe we shouldn't do it. And Junior pushed ahead, and that was really the hard launch of the Universal Monsters.
Right, because Frankenstein, I believe I mentioned before, maybe you could correct me, it actually doubled the gross. Because Dracula grossed what, about $1 million?
I trust you.
Okay, well, I appreciate you taking my word for it. But still, we can confirm though that Frankenstein did do better financially, and from there, it's okay, well, these horror movies, there's something here, so we definitely need to make more.
Yeah, and horror wasn't even an official genre when Dracula was made. They were called shockers or thrillers. They were kind of throwing different words at them. But after Dracula and Frankenstein, horror became what the genre was. And all of the other studios that I think also thought they were a little crazy to be making these movies, all the other studios started making horror films as well.
I sure did. I mean, what we have 2 years later, it's a little separate from Dracula and Frankenstein, but RKO puts out King Kong. In 35, you had a huge boom in horror movies from a lot of the major studios outside of Universal, because you had Mad Love and I think even a couple of years ago. Well, yes, White Zombie in 32, but in 33 you had the Mystery of the Wax Museum, which was the precursor to House of Wax. Spoiler alert, House of Wax is actually a reboot. didn't know if you knew that, but anyways, so this was a good time for your family from, say, 30 through 30, well, I guess really 36, but then England sort of put the kibosh on they sort of banned horror films. So I'm sure that
Well, yeah, Hollywood, like censorship and the Hays Code and all of that comes in, and that there's maybe 2 or 3 years where there really aren't horror films made, and that goes back to, you know, what I was saying, like there were a lot of religious groups that thought that these types of movies were going to corrupt people, or they were, we call it kind of sacrilegious, and different states were creating their own censorship boards and deeming what movies were acceptable to play and whatnot. So the Hays Code comes in so that Hollywood could kind of regulate itself. But that meant that there were a few years without horror.
But of course, the sort of the decline in horror films, it also sort of happened. It's as if it was sort of attached to, unfortunately, the end of the Laemmle regime at Universal. So I wanted to talk a little bit more because, you know, we have, I guess at that height, we have Bride of Frankenstein. And then, of course, the next year, 36, we have The Invisible Ray. I'm not sure that it did quite as successful as Bride of Frankenstein. Still love that movie. Karloff and Lugosi, if you haven't seen it, by the way. But then, you know,
Dracula's Daughter comes out right
well, yeah, and then, thank you for reminding me. Yes, Dracula's Daughter. Good movie. Still kind of wish that we had the real Lugosi instead of Dunning, but that's just me. But towards the end of 36 into 37, we have a couple of incidents that basically sort of spell the end for the Laemmles, and I was kind of wondering if we could go in a little bit and just sort of see how the rise and fall kind of.
How did it happen?
Right, how did it happen?
Studio? Why am I not actually the heiress to Universal?
Right, why aren't you going to Universal right now?
So, going back to how Carl Laemmle Sr. would make a ton of movies every year, much smaller budget. He was very frugal, very budget conscious. Junior comes in, he wants to make fewer movies each year, a much bigger budget, bigger risk, bigger reward. Now, he made really good movies. He made the Universal Monster movies. He made All Quiet on the Western Front, which won Universal's very first Academy Award. Imitation of Life, and, you know, a lot of movies that did really well, but some of them didn't. So in 1936, they had just made like Sutter's Gold and Magnificent Obsession, which either didn't do well or just hadn't come out yet. They were making Showboat, which was being directed by James Whale, the same James Whale that did all these horror films. He was making this like hyper-American musical. But it was a really big budget film. It was going over budget, it was going over schedule, and Junior convinces his dad to take out the first sort of loan, and they put up the studio as collateral. And it was a really big gamble, but they knew that Showboat was going to be a hit, or they really felt it was. And they really thought they were going to get the movie out on time. And they didn't really think, like, even though the bank had the option to buy Universal, they didn't think the bank was going to want to. They were like, what would they want with a movie studio? So we're going to be fine, everything will be fine. But the production just kept going over time and budget. The bank did make good on the loan, and they did exercise their option to buy Universal, and that was it. So then we were out. And when Showboat came out, it ended up being one of Universal's biggest hits. So like they were technically right, they just didn't have the time to see it through.
And I don't know if you know this, but so Showboat was directed by James Whale, and I believe that was his second to last movie that he did, because he did Showboat, and then right after that he did The Road Back, which was
the Journey's End sequel.
right. It was it was supposed to be like a spiritual sequel to All Quiet on the Western Front, but I don't think that put him in the director's chair. Basically, they were a lot more unforgiving back in those days. It's like, oh, you made a bad movie and it bombed. Well, thanks but no thanks. But you know, even though this was sort of the end of the Laemmles having control over Universal Studios, your uncle still, for the last few years of his life, and you hinted at it earlier, he lived quite a remarkable, I would say a very selfless life, because like you said, he actually did a lot for bringing a lot of Jewish refugees in from Europe, and so it's a wonderful story. He didn't just bring them here, but he really gave them a great life, and I really want to hear more about
I
this.
mean, he could sort of see the writing on the wall, what was happening in Germany very early, and he was pretty outspoken about it. The same way, you know, and obviously a little bit different, but the same way with Edison, that he could see that what was happening, like, wasn't fair or wasn't right. That's how he, you know, like, he just had this way of seeing when things were unjust and really wanting to speak out or be there or make a difference. So very early on, he started trying to write and speak with politicians, to help, I don't know, make a difference or do something over there. And then he started trying to bring Jewish refugees over here to the United States. So while he was at Universal, he would sponsor Jews to come to the United States. He would set them up with homes and jobs at Universal. And then even once he left the studio, he didn't just like rest on his laurels and kick his feet back. He hired a couple full-time secretaries, and he just devoted his whole life to trying to bring over everybody that he could. So we know about 300 Jewish families that he brought over. Then the Secretary of State at the time basically told him that he couldn't anymore, even though he more than proved that he could, you know, financially take care of them and help them. Just said no. So then Carl sort of turned his attention to reaching out to like all of our relatives and all of our friends and trying to convince them to do the same. Something that's not really talked about enough is just like the complacency or even complicitness of the U.S. while everything was happening abroad. That like we just had restrictive immigration policies in place that were a barrier to the safety of a lot of people abroad. But anyway, so that's what Uncle Carl turned his attention to full time. And even when he wasn't at Universal anymore, he would do things like, there's a family where he bought them a fourplex and let them live in one unit and rent out the other three so that they could support themselves. And he would get people jobs at restaurants or with other friends. He would just do whatever he could to make sure that people were really on their feet and taken care of.
And so, a beautiful way to end the story of your Uncle Carl. I'm kind of curious, what kind of Julian after their end at Universal?
Yeah, so he left Universal about a year after his dad. I think maybe he toyed with the idea of staying or continuing to produce, but I don't necessarily think that the next owners of Universal were so welcoming to him. He also got a contract at MGM for a bit where he was going to make horror films for them, and nothing really came of it. And, you know, over the next 20, 30 years, just every couple years, you'll see a newspaper article or something that says he's gonna make a film, and nothing really comes of it. I know, you know, from family lore, one of his big tasks that he took on after his dad passed was just continuing to take care of the refugees that they've been brought over. He sort of had a fund or a foundation that he helped continue that work through. He had a handful of years where he was just a bachelor and a party guy, and he had a great time around LA. And then in his older years, he got MS, and so the end of his life was a little reclusive and quiet.
Well, so just one more question, and then if you're all right with it, I'd love to turn you over to the audience, just in case they have any questions.
Yeah.
But so Universally Me is your web series that you have on your YouTube channel. So you talk about the Universal monster films. You also talk about, you know, just tidbits of your family history. But I also noticed on your channel you have some reaction videos of some newer Universal reboots, and I'm kind of curious. Like, are you excited about those? Like, going out to watch those in the future?
So, I will say yes, excited, but I'll also just say cautiously optimistic.
Okay.
I've been, I think we've all been burned a lot by some of the remakes, and that's really disappointing. But in a general sense, I think the remakes are a really good thing. I don't think that any remake serves to replace or erase any of the original monsters. I almost view them as a potential entree for somebody new to get into the originals, right? Oh, I really love this Wolfman movie. What other Wolfman movies exist? I love this vampire movie. What other vampires are out there? So I think that there's a lot of opportunity there. And I do look at, I watched this upcoming Wolfman trailer. I like the work that Leigh Whannell has done. I really loved his Invisible Man and the way that they modernized that immediate, the original monster movies, so many of them are like kind of allegories, or there are real lessons to be learned from them. The monsters they're not evil, they're not monsters for the most part. A lot of them are kind of victims of circumstance, and there's a lot we can connect to with them. So I appreciate with the new Invisible Man that he did the same. I anticipate that with the new Wolfman they're going to do something similar. I'm a little nervous about the January release date because that's not usually a good month for movies.
Yeah, it's a hard one.
But we'll see. And like James Wan is making the new Creature from the Black Lagoon. I like a lot of what James Wan has done, so I'm optimistic.
And Guillermo is making his own. Guillermo del Toro is making his own Frankenstein.
And so like I loved The Shape of Water. I thought that was it had such a unique perspective. I think it's so cool to make a movie off of this. Right, it's the concept of like, what if the monster and Julie Adams' character fell in love, right? And it creates this whole kind of new, kind of not movie based off of that. So anyway, my short answer, I guess, should be like, I'm cautiously optimistic, and I think that these remakes are just an opportunity for new people to fall in love with monsters.
Well, I think I don't want to say you speak for all of us, but I would say that you probably speak for a wide contingent of monster fans. But Antonia, thank you so much for your time. This was a delight. Folks, is there anyone out in the audience? Okay, so here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to be Phil Donahue for a second. I'm going to take this mic, put it down here. If you just want to come up and ask your question.
Really putting people on the spot.
Hello. My question is about Carla Lenley,
Yeah.
who, I guess for the audience, Carla Lenley was one of the, she was an actress who was the opening scene of Dracula, who had the opening line, and who was with us, I think, up until 10 years ago. So she lived a very long and fruitful life. My question to you is, did you know Carla Lenley, who would be your like great aunt, or your fourth cousin, or I'm not exactly sure?
She was my great grandfather's sister. I knew her very well. She lived, 10 minutes away from her for many years. So yes, my aunt Carla Lenley. I called her Aunt Carla. She was born in 1909, and she lived all the way until 2014. She was like. It's funny to say, like, I was so surprised when she passed away, but she was so sharp and with it literally until the day that she died. I actually did an interview with her in December of 2013, so I think she would have already been 104. I did an interview, it's on my YouTube channel, and she grew up living on the Universal Studios backlot, so she had the most amazing stories, like a fairy tale life. Of living on the lot, waking up in the morning, hearing the lions roar. There was a camel that would escape from the zoo, and she'd help like bring it back. Yeah. She was the prima ballerina in Phantom of the Opera and spoke the opening lines in Dracula. And she was a blast and so sweet. She used to, when she was alive, even into her hundreds, she would go to monster conventions and events all the time and talk about her work. She loved it.
Whoa.
I'll have to, so that's on, the interview is on YouTube?
Yes.
I'll have to, look that up. Thank you very much.
Woo!
Thank you.
It's actually, I watched it myself. It's a wonderful interview. Carla was always fantastic on documentaries and on interviews. She was just a delight.
I think she was so proud of the work that she had done. She danced, we know that she danced and acted in a ton of movies at Universal, but one of the other things that she did, which is like exciting for me, but also like frustrating, is she would dance and act in movies for other movie studios, but she wanted to feel like she had earned it and not that like she was getting roles because of her name. So she would dance as like under fake names or fake things, so we don't know all of the things that she's been in. But she loved to talk about her work and what she's done.
Wow.
Anyone else?
Come on up.
I'll say it for
Yeah, okay.
What's your YouTube channel again?
So my YouTube channel is called Universally Me. So you can either just look in the search bar, Universally Me, or you can look it up by my name, which is Antonia Carlotta.
And the interview was under that?
Yeah, it's on my channel. I believe it's titled something like Interview with 104-year-old actress Carla Lumley, something like that.
Thank you.
Of course, thank you. I just put up a video this morning, all about the life of Claude Rains.
Oh, wow.
Cool.
All right, who wants to be put on the spot? There's a brave soul coming down this way.
Can't take advantage, that's Ed Woodward.
I know this guy.
And he's doing
Greetings.
locomotive shit.
That gentleman actually asked the first question, which was about your name, which I've watched the documentary so many times. It's such a cool soul. And you have the resemblance too.
Thank you.
It's right. So, that question aside, going to when things got a little dirty in band, please help me with what movie was the one that people were done. Was it The Raven or was it The Black Cat? I think it was The Black Cat.
You know, factually, I don't know which one would be the one, but personally, I think the Black Cat
Because
explores
Carlotta
much
was
darker
skinned alive.
themes.
Right, yeah.
Skinned Alive, there's like necrophilia and that, and incest, and
Yeah.
all sorts of.
We won't even go
If
there.
anybody hasn't seen the Black Cat, it's a beautiful
Brilliant
shot
movie.
movie.
Oh.
It is a really good movie, but it is so dark that you would never believe it's from 1934. 1934. It's wild.
That and The Invisible Ray, Karloff, when we go to see it, are magnificent.
They are.
Thank you very much.
No, of course, thank you.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, actually, The Black Cat was the first of the classic, and in some cases not so classic, collaborations of Lugosi and Karloff.
Yeah, personally, I think that's my favorite of their collaboration.
Yeah,
They
one.
score so well against each other.
Well, just I think I agree with you solely on Lugosi's very last line in the film. What was it? It's in 5 minutes. You, me, and your rotten cult will be no more. Has been a good game.
That's very nice.
It's the accent. Anyone else? If you don't want to be put on the spot, you can just ask it from your seat. That's okay.
Quick question. You said that Junior had a production given to him for his 21st birthday. Do you happen to know what that production was?
Sorry, no, he became head of productions.
Oh,
Of
I
all
see.
productions. So, yeah, he was just kind of the man in charge, which, 21 sounds a little crazy, but he'd already had, 15 years experience in the industry and had the benefit of having youth on his side. So I know I have to look into what his very first production was, but I know one of them was All Five of the Western Front. Did you have a question?
Yeah, do you have a take or any intel on the Dark Universe theme park?
Ooh.
I believe it's opening in May. Is it May 2025?
Whoa.
Take your word for it.
I think, but I don't know anything beyond that. I haven't been there. Again, I'm like cautiously optimistic. It sounds cool from what I've read about it. I think it could be an opportunity for people to discover the monsters. I will say I went to the Halloween Horror Nights a few weeks ago, and they have kind of a classic monster Bride of Frankenstein themed haunted house. It wasn't great in my opinion, but I was happy to see the character there. She had a bow and arrow. I could never figure out why.
That's a head scratcher. Any more questions?
So for our first film, we're actually going backwards in time in terms of the Universal monster cycle. This movie was actually sort of the tail end of the golden era and the beginning of the big Universal Studios sci-fi monster boom. I like the origin story of this movie. This all began at a dinner party at the home of Orson Welles during the production of Citizen Kane. Film producer William Allen was in attendance, and he heard cinematographer Gabriel Figueroa talk about a myth about a race of half-men, half-fish creatures that were lurking about in the Amazon River. Of course, William Allen thought that this was just a terrific idea for a story, so he took story notes, and he handed it off to Morris Zim to write as a treatment, and then years later, the team of Arthur Ross and Henry Essex took that treatment, made a script into it, and it turned out to be what we're about to watch, The Creature from the Black Lagoon. Now, much of the credit of the monster design went to the makeup department head Bud Westmore, who was a great makeup artist in his own right. He was a protege of Jack Pierce, who created a lot of those earlier monster designs with Frankenstein, the Wolfman, the Mummy, and so on. However, there was a terrible oversight in film history, because the bulk of the credit for the design for Creature from the Black Lagoon actually goes to a lady named Millicent Patrick, who is a Disney animator. She is actually the one that created the head and much of the upper body of the Creature from the Black Lagoon. So we need to make sure that we give credit where credit is due. We honor the work of Millicent Patrick, as well as the stellar cast of, the stellar cast of Richard Carlson, the lovely Julie Adams, Nestor Aiva, and of course Ben Chapman and Rico Browning, who portrayed our creature on the land sequences and underwater sequences respectively. Give it up for Creature from the Black Lagoon in glorious 3D. Up to this point, Karloff was actually a bit of a struggling actor. It's rumored that in between gigs, he was actually he was brewing his own bathtub gin during the height of the Great Depression. But he sort of hit a stride in 1930 and 1931 by appearing in some high-profile gangster films, such as Five Points Gang and the original Scarface with Paul Newman. One day he was eating lunch at the Universal Studios commissary, and David Lewis, who happened to be the partner of James Whale and a producer at Universal, noticed Karloff and was immediately fascinated by his very distinct facial features. So he had told James Whale about him, and of course they met, and James Whale ordered a screen test for Karloff as the monster. They presented this to the Universal executives, and the rest, as they say, is history. But the price of fame came with a very steep price indeed. Boris Karloff endured hours of makeup application, in addition to having to wear a bodysuit and those very, very heavy boots. It added close to about 100 pounds. It was very much like a suit of armor. And during the windmill scene, he actually broke his back during production. There was some love lost between him and James Whale in that process. It was incidents like these that sort of resonated with Karloff in the back of his mind. He wanted to prevent actors from ever having to endure such cruel working conditions like this. So he took it upon himself, along with Humphrey Bogart, Edward G. Robinson, and Bela Lugosi, to start the Screen Actors Guild in order to protect actors from things like this. What you're about to see is a clip of a brief interview that I gave with Eric Kurland, who is the executive director of the 3D Space Museum in LA. We had him come up on stage to sort of explain the interesting intricacies of 3D and how 3D movies are made. We watched Creature from the Black Lagoon in 3D. That was the first film that I introduced in this marathon. It's the first time I had seen it in 3D. It was a phenomenal experience, and really, if you ever have the chance to watch it in 3D, I couldn't recommend it enough. Creature from the Black Lagoon is a perfect film for 3D, and being a mad scientist, you would think that I would know a little something about the technology of it, but alas, I'm completely dumb. I don't know anything. But thankfully, we had the smarty pants in the realm of 3D, and Eric was there to lend us a hand. Let me bring up our first guest presenter this afternoon. He is the executive director of the LA 3D Museum. Ladies and gentlemen, please give it up for Eric Kurland. Hi, how's this setup work for you? Is this good?
Yeah, sure. Hello, everyone.
So I mentioned before we got started with things, I love 3D, but I don't know anything about it. So I was hoping you could tell us something, just a little bit about it.
Sure. Well, in 1952, a movie came out around Thanksgiving called Blood and Devil. It was filmed in 3D. Started a 3D craze that lasted all through 1953 and a little bit into 1954 when Creature came out. And to make a 3D movie back in the 1950s, they actually had to shoot 2 movies simultaneously. They were filming with 2 cameras, one to shoot a whole version of the movie from the left.
Don't worry, I get a little emotional about the film we're about to watch because, well, frankly, I have a love-hate relationship with it. I hate it in a lot of ways because I feel like Bram Stoker stole my memoirs and cut me out of the residuals. But I love it because I don't think there was ever a person born in any era of human history that could have played me or Dracula as well as Bela Lugosi. And you see, it's difficult to talk about Dracula without talking about Bela Lugosi. Because I feel like people don't realize just how impactful his performance in this film was. Has anybody actually read the novel Dracula? Okay, so correct me if I'm wrong. Dracula isn't exactly described as sexy. The guy has fur growing out of the palms of his hands. I haven't met a woman who finds that attractive yet, but I'm sure she's out there somewhere. But in the meantime, it's not your archetype of classic beauty. And when Lugosi came in, when he played Dracula on Broadway, when he played Dracula in this film that we're about to watch, his performance was so mesmerizing, so iconic, that from that point on, when you ask a child to talk like Dracula, he talks like Bela Lugosi. Julian David Stone was also a guest at Gardena that weekend. He's the author of It's Alive, a phenomenal historical fiction novel about the making of Frankenstein, particularly the story of Carl Laemmle Jr. and his role in the making of that picture. What you are about to see was a live interview and Q&A I got to do with Julian just before the final film of the marathon. And too long, they tend to get a little irritable and cranky. So, and I tell you, I've had a great time. This has been a wonderful experience to be here for the last couple of days. But even vampires get a little groggy sometimes. So, so I'm fortunate to have just a quick chance to sit down. But a great opportunity to sit here with my new friend, Julian David Stone. Like I mentioned in previous segments, he is the author of a historic fiction novel called It's Alive. Actually, you know what? I have to do that properly. He is the author of a historic fiction novel, It's Alive! And I have the book here. I bought myself a copy, so I highly encourage you to do the same if you haven't already. So, Julian, first of all, thank you so much for coming out this evening.
It's my pleasure. It's been great being here. I wish I could have been here yesterday. Just a great 10 films, just terrific films.
Better late than never,
Yes,
is what I always say.
Exactly.
So, Julian, just right off the bat, what, in your own words, tell us what is It's Alive? What's the story?
Okay, It's Alive is my novel. It's about the making of the 1931 Frankenstein, and it's about Carl Laemmle Jr. and what he went through getting Frankenstein made. I don't know if you saw my presentation, but he was 21 years old when he was put in charge of Universal Studios. And he's the one who chose to make the original classic horror films, and it's a typical story. Everybody thought he was out of his mind, that nobody would want to go see them, and here we are 90 years later, you know, with seeing these films, and every Halloween they're played, and they're some of the most famous characters in the history of cinema. Everybody knows these characters, even people that have never even seen the movies, even the actors. Lugosi and Karloff, people, as you were talking about, will do imitations of them, who've never even seen the films. They just know their personalities, they're so famous. So that's what my novel is. It's just I wanted to explore this character because he's been completely forgotten.
So what got you interested in this particular story, but also really just monster movies in general?
Great question. I grew up in the 70s, a monster kid like a lot of people, and loved the films as a kid, and then got older, got interested in other things, and then I rediscovered the films when in the late 90s, early 2000s as an adult, and I saw a lot more in them. As you see them as an adult, they're very complex films, and I was also working in the film business at that point, so I got very interested in what went on behind the scenes. And when I started to read about it, when I landed on Junior Lemley, I just couldn't get over a 21-year-old running a movie studio, and just that he was literally the one that wanted to make these films. And I became obsessed with trying to figure out why did he want to make them. And that's ultimately what I explore in the novel, because there are some interesting things in his past that lead you very clearly to why he was interested in this material when nobody else was.
So just really quick, you said something that really piqued my curiosity a bit. You said you worked in the film industry. In what capacity?
So I was a screenwriter for about 15 years. I worked for various studios. A couple things got made, nothing that you would have heard of. But I had a nice run of rewriting and selling things that unfortunately most of them didn't get made, but it was fun. And then I more or less got aged out and sort of moved into writing novels from that.
Okay. Well, you say it's nothing anybody's heard of, but I say try.
Although it was funny, but I had a son later in life. I had a 10-year-old son, so I'm one of the older fathers where my son goes to school, and somebody came up to me because they had actually seen it. They couldn't believe I had written this movie that they had seen, that I don't think anybody had seen. It was called Savate. It was a kickboxing western. Yeah, I didn't think anybody heard of it, but I couldn't believe it.
I haven't heard of it.
No,
but I'm gonna watch it.
No, you don't.
A kickboxing western?
Yeah. You write a lot of scripts in your life, and I just can't believe that had to be one of the ones that got made. I gave it my all. I don't want to say I didn't do, but it was just, you work on certain ones that you feel better about, and those don't get made, but the kickboxing western gets made.
Well, now I have this mental image of Clint Eastwood, cowboy hat and cigar, or cigarillo from the Man with No Name trilogy, just walking up to somebody and just going, "Kata!"
No, there's no Clint Eastwood in this movie, I assure you.
Well, so I imagine that for this novel, you had to do a fair amount of research. And in your research, particularly for Carl Lemley Jr., what do you find to be the most fascinating trait about him, whether that's in his maybe a personality quirk or perhaps something in his professional life, like an accomplishment?
Well, what was really interesting about him is that he was the first of the second generation. You have the first generation, the founders of the film business, which was his father, Carl Lemley, and Adolf Zucker, and all of these. He was the first of the second generation to take over and work in the film business. So he's very much, the first generation are almost all from Eastern Europe, the Jewish immigrants. He's born in America, so when he comes to power in the 20s, he's like a jazz baby. And so you have this hip guy who's suddenly, running a movie studio, and when you see interviews with him, he talks kind of in 20s jargon, and it's kind of interesting. So I found that really fascinating, that he was the first of the next generation to take over a movie studio.
So he was more likely to say things like, "That was a humdinger of a hoot man."
Right, or he has one interview in the New York Times where he talks about, "I'm all about this right now," just that expression, using "I'm all about horror" or whatever. It was just, his father certainly didn't talk that way.
Right, I feel like that kind of lexicon has made its way back into I feel like that's what the kids are saying nowadays. I'm all about this, or I'm all about the vibes, or something.
Going on a tangent here, but the 20s, some of the lingo of the 20s is kind of some of it is still used today, like the word cute goes back to the 20s, and that's still used today. A lot of other words aren't, but that's kind of when you get the farthest back of, dial or expressions that are still used.
So, something that's been percolating in my mind for a while. I asked Antonia Carlotta yesterday. She didn't quite have an answer for me, but I'm wondering if you found anything. So, big Lugosi fan here, and Lugosi was in the previous movie, and we're essentially have it's like a triumvirate of Lugosi films today. My question is, do you happen to know what the relationship, if any, looked like between the Lemleys and Bela Lugosi?
That's a good question, because I sort of talk about that. You know, how do I put it? They kept hiring him, so clearly they liked him. You know, he did other films for them. Thinking of them in the context of what they were doing, they were running a studio, so I don't think they probably had an opinion either way. He was just another actor that they wanted to work with, but they liked him, and Junior made him a star. He put him in Dracula, though, as famously he was not his first choice, which seems inconceivable to us, when you see the film, because there would be, as I gave the presentation for Dracula, we wouldn't be here without his amazing performance.
Do you get why they wanted Ian Keith to play the
Well, he wasn't the only one. It's a business, and they wanted, and as I talked about, Junior wanted to be sure that this film was going to be a success, and Bela Lugosi wasn't a name.
Sure.
So that's really what it comes down to. I think he wanted somebody who had a bigger name. Ian Keith was one of the people they talked to. There were other bigger names.
But isn't it weird? It's like he was in the running back in the 30s, and then 17 years later, like after long after the success of Dracula, I understand, they couldn't get John Kerrigan, but then somehow Ian Keith finds his way back in the picture 17 years later.
It's, I have a different presentation that I do on Karloff and Lugosi and their careers, and I talk about the 8 films they did together, and every step of the way, it's just, Bela just has the worst luck. Every turn, you just don't get what it doesn't, he's so good, and you just don't understand. I mean, it's great that he kept working all the time, but he should have gotten, better projects.
So speaking of, can you put this to rest? Because there's conflicting accounts. Some folks say that Bela Lugosi turned down Frankenstein outright. If you take the Ed Wood route,
right.
He turned it down because the part was quote unquote not sexy enough. They didn't want to be covered in all that makeup and collodion and whatnot. But others, like film historian Kim Newman, say that there is no record of Bela Lugosi ever turning down anything in his career. So why on earth would he turn down potentially the biggest role of his life?
Well, one, nobody knew it was going to be the biggest, could have been a flop. It's the same thing. I kind of side with it. That may have just been him protecting what had happened, because Junior Lemley later in life, one interviewer who got to see him, one of the tragedies of Junior's life and kind of what the crusade I was on with among other things with writing the book is that he didn't get his due, because he died just about the time that the Monster Kids had grown up and started writing books, so only a couple of people interviewed him before he died. And he said that there was a screen test made of Lugosi as the monster, and he hated it, and he fired him from it. So, it all happens around the same time that then James Whale comes on the project, and it could have been a combination. Whale wanted to go in a different direction. Movies are just chaos. But my wife is a costumer, and she literally, tomorrow, she's doing a very big sitcom, and tomorrow, it hasn't gone on yet, but it's going to be on Hulu. Tomorrow was the first day of shooting. They literally fired somebody on Friday. So she's coming in tomorrow to shoot the first episode, and there will be a new actress, and it's not a small role, and that's just movies. There's constant turmoil, and part of what my novel deals with is that, and this is actual in the historical record, that the decision whether who was going to play the monster came down to the last minute, because Lugosi leaves the project about 2 months before he's replaced or leaves or whatever you want to say, and then there's a very famous letter that James Whale wrote about 2 weeks before the beginning of production. It's in the copy of the script for Colin Clive, who plays Dr. Frankenstein, and with it is a letter from James Whale, and he says in this letter, playing the role of the monster will be Bela Lugosi or Boris Karloff. So somehow, 2 weeks before the beginning of shoot, Bela's back in the mix. And so, I explore that because I think that that's really fascinating. And Karloff's connection to the movie, the very first time he's ever connected in any press or anything, is the first day of shooting. It's finally, put out in the press that he has been cast.
So on that note, the decision comes down to the last second, basically.
Yeah.
And then Karloff is the guy to play the monster. What do you think happened in that? And I know, and obviously I know that that does play out in your novel.
Yeah, that's what.
But
I think in the way that I think Junior panicked that he didn't have a star. That he was going to go with Karloff, and nobody had heard of him. One of the other things, again, in my other talk, I talk about Karloff was a struggling actor before he did Frankenstein. He's in his mid-40s. He's been in Hollywood for 10 years. He's been in over 80 movies. Before, Sarah Karloff, who wrote a wonderful note to me after my book came out, and she made a funny comment that your book is a fun retelling of my father becoming an overnight success after 10 years in the business. And that's basically where he was at. He had been in 80 movies, and so he just was not known. And I think Junior just panicked, And give you another example of where Karloff was in his career. Right after they finished shooting Frankenstein, a movie comes out, I think it's called Now or Never, starring Gloria Swanson. Boris Karloff is in this movie. He has a tiny role. The name of his character is Waiter. His character doesn't even have a name. That shows you where his career was at. And then 6 months later, he has become such a big star that 6 months later, The Mummy comes out, the next film in the cycle. He's now so famous on the poster for The Mummy, he doesn't even have a first name. He's Karloff, and the size of his name on the poster for The Mummy is the size of the title of the movie.
he must have had a good publicist.
Well, he became a star because he did an unbelievable performance in Frankenstein.
So one thing I'm curious about, we hear of these stories over the decades that essentially become caricatures of what the day-to-day looks like for a movie executive. And I was wondering, are there any similarities to today? What Carl Lindley Jr. or really Uncle Carl would go through on a day-to-day basis, essentially running, a successful major studio?
Absolutely. Everything with the film business was exactly the same 100 years ago. It's just the reality of it. Nothing changes. It's just a crazy business. There's a film from the same year as Frankenstein, from 1931 called Showgirl in Hollywood. Not a particularly great film, but if you see this film, every cliche of today is in that movie. The casting couch, just everything you can imagine of what the film business is right there 90 years ago not more than 90 years ago, in this film. So, no, I'm sure he dealt with exactly the same nonsense that they deal with today.
Basically just putting out fires and hopefully not as extreme as David O. Selznick.
I'm sure that they dealt with plenty.
Julian also gave a few presentations in between some of the films about the history of those movies and just horror films in general. And if you'd like to follow his work along with Antonia's and 3D Spaces, I have their social media links and YouTube links in the show notes page below, so be sure to follow them. Tell them that the Count sent you. That's all the time I have this evening. Thank you for watching, and be sure to subscribe in order to get more notifications for future videos on Count Drahoon Presents. But until then, as far as things go when things go bump in the night, there are such things.
From ghoulies and ghosties.
And long-leggedy beasties.
And long-legged beasties.
And things that go bump in the night. Good Lord! Deliver us.